Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Thursday the 9th of December and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and today I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First we will have today's coronavirus update, then I will give you today's headlines, then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then we will look at today's Scottish Government budget together. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 3,741,365 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,988,560 have been confirmed negative and 752,805 have tested positive. There are 3,196 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. Of the people who have tested positive, 578 were in hospital last night, 39 of whom were in intensive care. I'm sorry to say that there are 16 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive, and that means that the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by coronavirus now stands at 9,688. The latest UK daily figures show 146,135 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that's an increase of 148 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. And as of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,358,725 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, 3,967,477 had received their second dose, and 2,915 have received a third dose or booster. Now, the Conservative Party have been fined £17,800 for failing to report the financing of the Downing Street flat redecoration. After an 8-month investigation by the Electoral Commission, which regulates political parties' income and spending, it found that the Conservatives had not reported a donation of £52,801. SNP Westminster leader Ian Blackford MP said that Boris Johnson and the Tory party were at the core of sleaze and corruption after failing to declare the donation. A review into government staff parties in defiance of COVID rules has been widened to look at more events, including one that Boris Johnson is believed to have attended in person. The investigation by Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, was only to be looking into a party inside Downing Street on the 18th of December last year. However, it has now been announced that it will also examine another Downing Street event on the 27th of November, and reported to be a leaving event for a staff member at which Boris Johnson spoke. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, today pushed the button to detonate the explosives to demolish the Longannet power station chimney this morning, to signify the end of coal-fired electricity generation in Scotland. Longannet was the largest of its kind in Europe when it began generating enough electricity to power a quarter of Scottish homes in 1970. The First Minister has also written to Prime Minister Boris Johnson urging the UK government to address international vaccine inequity. The letter asks the UK government to join over 100 countries in supporting a temporary waiver of obligations to protect intellectual property for COVID-19 vaccines. And nearly 100 former British Council staff employed to teach British values and the English language remain in hiding in Afghanistan after having so far been refused the right to come to the UK by officials. Their plight has been taken up by Joseph Seaton, the former British Council Afghanistan English manager and its deputy director, who has written to the most relevant cabinet members in a bid to gain their support. The staff applied to come to the UK under the UK government's Afghan Relocations and Assistance Policy, ARAP, which was set up earlier this year. But Seaton says that their applications remain unprocessed and without response months after they were submitted. Given the number of COVID-19 outbreaks, particularly those caused by Omicron, that are being linked to Christmas parties, Public Health Scotland is urging people to defer such parties at this time. Dr. Nick Finn, the Director of Public Health Science and Medical Director, said that there is much that we still need to learn about Omicron, but early evidence suggests that this new COVID variant is much more transmissible. The impact of this transmissibility has been seen in recent weeks, with a number of Omicron outbreaks linked to parties. Dr. Finn reminded people to follow the measures to keep safe over the festive period. Please get your vaccine and your booster when your turn comes. Please test at least twice weekly using lateral flow devices, and take a test each time you are socialising with people out with your household. Reduce the number of people you catch up with, try to meet outdoors, or if indoors, ensure that the ventilation is good. And keep up other public health measures: wash your hands, clean surfaces, maintain distances, and of course, wear a face covering in public spaces. So those are this evening's news headlines. And we are lucky now to be joined this evening by Michelle Thomson, who since 2019 has been the MSP for Falkirk East. Hello, Michelle. How's life with the bairns today?
Oh, fine, thank you. But I have to point out that I only became the MSP for Falkirk East in May of this year.
That's what I meant to say. That's what I meant to say. In May 2021. Thank you for that correction, Michelle. I'm grateful to you. What we'll do now is we'll look at the Scottish Government budget that was announced in Holyrood this afternoon, and we'll go through a number of the announcements and discuss the implications both in terms of the budget and a little bit of the politics as well. So this afternoon at around 3:30, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Kate Forbes, stood up in the chamber at Holyrood to deliver her third budget. This budget was unusual in that because of the Bute House agreement between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Greens, there will not be the usual process of haggling and horse trading in order to secure enough votes to be passed. So in that sense, the Cabinet Secretary had a little more latitude. In contrast, perhaps, she argued this afternoon that financially she's more constrained than last year, and we'll look at that issue in a little while. The Cabinet Secretary said, "My last two budgets have been shaped by our experiences of COVID, but we are now lifting our eyes to the future. This is a transitional budget as people, businesses and services get back on their feet." She continued, "This budget focuses on tackling the climate emergency, reducing inequalities and supporting economic recovery. It is the first budget of this partnership in government and has been developed in cooperation with the Scottish Green Party, delivering on commitments made as part of the Bute House Agreement," and she welcomed their support and their constructive challenge. Patrick Harvey, who is co-leader of the Greens and is also now a government minister as a result of the Bute House Agreement, said, "This budget delivers on key commitments made in the cooperation agreement between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Greens, including making bus travel free to children and young people and doubling the Scottish Child Payment. Our plans will also see over £2 billion invested in tackling the climate emergency, helping accelerate a just transition to a net zero economy, and laying the foundations for a green economic recovery." So I've got five headlines, if you will, from the budget here. Firstly, £18 billion in funding for the NHS and social care sector, and that includes setting the groundwork for the creation of a new national care service, doubling the Scottish Child Payment to £20 a week from April, and then extending it to under 16s by the end of 2022. And that's estimated that it will reach 400,000 children and help to lift an estimated 40,000 children out of poverty. A new public sector pay policy that introduces a public sector wage floor of £10.50 per hour. £1.4 billion for the police, maintaining the government's commitment to protect police resource budgets in real terms for the duration of this Parliament, and £831 million investment in affordable housing, progressing the government's commitment to deliver 110,000 affordable energy-efficient homes by 2032. So, Michelle, out of those headlines, which struck you as the top headline?
Well, I think for all of us, the big takeout needs to be the doubling of the Scottish Child Payment. That is utterly revolutionary. And of course, the counterpoint to that has been the cut of £20 a week, the equivalent amount in universal credit by Westminster. make no mistake, this is genuinely groundbreaking and is ambitious and clearly sets out what the SNP government is about in terms of putting its values front and centre of the budget, and where better to do that than with young people. And so that to me is, even though it was announced last week, it's a massive standout, massively ambitious, and I completely celebrate it.
Thanks, Michelle. What we'll do this evening is we'll look at the budget from a number of different perspectives: poverty, climate change, COVID recovery, the cost of living crisis that is impending, and we'll look also at some other income and expenditure issues. But to put a little bit of wider context onto the budget today and what we'll be discussing, the Scottish Fiscal Commission are now also forecasting the level of long-term economic scarring to the Scottish economy from COVID-19 of around -2%, and that's similar to the Office for Budget Responsibilities forecast for the UK economy. And this means that the long-term impact of Brexit on the economy will be worse than that caused by COVID-19, because the Office for Budget Responsibility is attributing a -4% long-term reduction in living standards following the EU exit. The budget also says that initial trade data also supports the assumption that UK trade with the EU will be 15% lower due to Brexit. And for Scotland, the Revenue and Customs regional trade statistics show that exports to the EU decreased by 8%, that's £500 million, to £6.4 billion in the first 6 months of this year. And that's the first period of the first phase of the EU exit trade barriers being in place. And that's comparing it to the first 6 months of 2020. So, Michelle, what's your view as to the difficult economic headwinds that this budget is facing in terms of the shrinkage of the economy that is being estimated both as a result of COVID, but even more so as a result of Brexit?
Well, I think Kate Forbes is an extremely accomplished and skillful politician, and she quite rightly set out before today's announcement that this would be a challenging budget. And of course, as you make clear, these gaps, the drop of 4% because of Brexit and the drop of 2% because of COVID, does highlight how challenging it is. The UK government have made much of their claim that there is more in the block grant this year, but as Kate Forbes correctly pointed out, that excludes COVID consequentials. And looking at the issues we have at the moment with Omicron, there's considerable uncertainty, and nobody could escape the fact that we are still in the midst of a pandemic. And let's not forget as well that it was the Tories that negotiated the hardest of hard Brexits in the full knowledge of that, and probably the full knowledge that we would be in this position with the pandemic. So I think the difficulty, the economic circumstances can't be overestimated. These are challenging times, and Kate Forbes had a block grant to juggle with to try and meet the priorities that we in the SNP hold dear and that the people of Scotland hold dear, against quite a really malignant backdrop where we see the national insurance, for example, that's going to be kicking in, the rise in that coming soon, and who knows what else coming down the track from the UK government. So I think skillfully done to match the priorities we hold dear, but very challenging times. And the issue around Brexit can't be overestimated. And I know it's become popular with the Tories that we don't talk about the B word, as I've taken to referring to it, but we can't forget about that. And the trade deals that have been negotiated are utterly paltry compared to what we had with the single market when we were part of Europe. So challenging times, and Kate Forbes was very right to call that out.
Thanks, Michelle. So the first prism through which we'll have a look at today's Scottish budget is poverty. The Cabinet Secretary said that this budget will provide certainty and stability for families whilst working to reduce inequalities, the process for which has already begun when the First Minister, as you say, recently announced the doubling of the child payment to £20 per child per week from April, reaching over 105,000 children under the age of 6, and then extending it to all under 16s at the end of next year, and that's about 400,000 children and their families. So this is a little bit of a shopping list, if you will. So please, if anything jumps out at you, please shout. But once I'll run through the what I took to be the headlines of the various budget announcements that are focused on addressing poverty, and in particular child poverty in Scotland, bearing in mind that we know that child poverty in Scotland is the equal lowest of any of the 4 nations in the United Kingdom. But given its priority in this budget, I thought that we should look at it first. So as we say, the doubling of the child payment, the Scottish child payment, to £20 per week from April, and that's going to cost £197 million. Ahead of the expansion of the Scottish child payment to under 16s, there'll be a Scottish child payment bridging payment, providing £520 payment for every child who's in receipt of free school meals due to a low income. There's £41 million for the Scottish Welfare Fund, which helps people in times of crisis, and £80 million in fund discretionary housing payments, £24 million in a range of measures to support young people and families with the cost of the school day. So that's music tuition, curriculum charges, an increased school clothing grant, for example. There's £110 million to provide the free bus travel for young people from January. That means that money is put back in their pockets, and also at the same time encourages more people to use public transport. And £72 million for the continued expansion of free school lunches for all children in primaries 1 to 5 and special schools. And also there will be £21 million to continue to provide free school lunches during the school holidays, focusing on those who will benefit the most. And £831 million for affordable housing, progressing the government's commitment to deliver 110,000 affordable energy efficient homes across the next decade, leveraging further private sector investment and obviously thereby creating employment in the construction sector. So it struck me that firstly that's quite a lot of money, and secondly that's quite a broad range of topics, both directly funding people, finding ways to put money back into their pockets, and making sure that especially those who are most in need and young people are being fed at school, both during term time and during the school holidays. So what do you think, how would you characterise this basket of policies announced today, which are intended to address the challenges of poverty in Scotland?
With what we have available in the format where we're given a block grant, which of course is our money, which we raise in taxes in the first place, I think it is skillful and creative and clearly sends a message that we value our young people and that we value the concept of a society. But make no mistake, whilst I absolutely celebrate what the SNP has done, we're doing it against a backdrop of very challenging times. In any normal budget that you would hear talked about in Westminster, in fact I think it was Ken Gibson that pointed it out today, you would hear the Chancellor talking about what they would be doing with various taxes, national insurance, corporation tax, inheritance tax, VAT or whatever. Now Kate Forbes has to work with very limited levers in terms of the income tax that we do have, and without all the other areas that a normal Chancellor would have. So in that respect, I think there has been very careful and clever crafting of giving to people, to supporting people in difficult times. And it's about the message for me about we value people, we value young people, we value people who are on their hunkers through no fault of their own and where they're experiencing very difficult times because of a multitude of economic conditions, but exacerbated by COVID. So I think the spread of that really sets out what the SNP is about. And of course, you mentioned the free school meals. Maybe some people have forgotten about that. But again, that's a clear differentiator between what's happening in Scotland and how we value young people and what's happening in the rest of the UK. But the biggest of them all, again, I would say, is the Scottish Child Payment. I think that's absolutely standout.
And I think other people are agreeing with you, Michelle. I know that John Dickey, who's the director of the Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland, has said that the use of this budget to invest in children and double the new Scottish Child Payment is absolutely the right thing to do. he said it's a really big step forward on the path to meeting Scotland's child poverty targets. So we'll move on to the next perspective on today's budget, which is round about climate change, and I sense that there's a definite follow on from all of the work that was done during the COP26 meetings in Glasgow. So the budget says that it lays the groundwork to secure a green recovery and follow through on commitments to implement the recommendations of the Just Transition Commission. And so in the budget, there is provided the first £20 million of the 10-year £500 million Just Transition Fund, and that identifies key projects through co-design with those impacted by a transition to net zero. And that is in particular, this £20 million is to accelerate the development of a transformed and decarbonised economy in the northeast and Moray. It's £414 million for energy efficiency and low carbon and renewable heat, cutting emissions, making homes warmer, tackling fuel poverty and creating jobs across Scotland. £33 million across a range of large-scale industrial decarbonisation projects. £23.5 million for the Green Jobs Fund, which helps businesses create green employment through investment. £6 million for the Climate Justice Fund, which is part of the commitment to invest £36 million to help those countries most affected by climate change, yet least responsible for it. £150 million for walking, wheeling and cycling. £53 million to protect and restore nature, including internationally important peatlands, and another £70 million to be invested in creating more woodland. £96 million for delivery of investment programmes to regenerate communities, revitalising town centres. £1.4 billion to improve and decarbonise the rail network, and £35 million to support the Scotland's Zero Emission Bus Challenge Fund, and so that helps with the purchase of ultra low and zero emission buses and the cost of the infrastructure to run the buses. £304 million to support bus services and their users through the older and disabled persons bus scheme, smart cards, increased support for services, and so this is intended to increase support for services as they recover from the impacts of the pandemic. £50 million for the farming sector to help in tackling climate and nature emergencies and to produce food more sustainably. And finally, £43 million to encourage Scotland's circular economy, which is intended to reduce reliance on scarce resources and reduce waste as an essential contribution to tackling the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. So, Michelle, it strikes me that in that basket of proposals, we have the hyper-local, we have local town centre regeneration programmes, and we have the global with the provision of assistance and funding through the Climate Justice Fund to countries around certain countries around the world most affected by climate change, yet least responsible for it. So, from that perspective, do the elements in the budget today, do they give a sense of the perspective that the government is taking in respect to climate change, everything from the local to the global?
I would say so. I mean, again, the government has made abundantly clear that there must be a transition, but furthermore, there must be a just transition. And there will be many of your viewers tonight who remembered what happened to the old traditional industries and how wastelands of economic despair were created by the Tory government. So they've set their stall out very clearly about putting the money where their mouth is to create a fund for a just transition. And you correctly point out from the kind of local to the national that there's steps and there's measures every step of the way there. Because the other thing is as well, we need to bring people with us on this journey. Everybody is now starting to sense, right, how can I play my part in changing things? How can I play my part in addressing climate change? And we all know that we have a personal responsibility as well as the Scottish Government having a national responsibility. So it starts to put the changes that we can all make back to individual people. And so by giving that the 150 million for walking, cycling and so on, that starts to enable that. So I actually think it's a very clever move to making something which is nationally important real to every single person and make sure we can all play our part. So again, going back to my summary headlines at the top, this is clever, it's creative, and it's absolutely touching the priorities that have been so clearly set out in the programme for government, a just transition and linked to climate change. And again, it contrasts with what's happening in Westminster. And of course, there was a bit of argy-bargy, as you might imagine, in the chamber. And of course, it was commented out that the UK government have singularly failed to support the carbon capture and storage plans for the North East. And again, they're not putting their money where their mouth is. And, you know, until they actually do something substantive, there's going to be that clear gap continuing between what Westminster are saying and not doing and what the Scottish Government are saying and indeed are doing.
Thanks, Michelle. You beat me to the point there. I was going to ask you. We've already touched on the increase in the Scottish child payment to £20 a week, and the close correlation between that and the Westminster government's abandoning of the COVID-related uplift in universal credit. And so there might be an argument there that the Scottish government is filling a gap or addressing a problem created by Westminster. And then, as you say, with the proposed Acorn carbon capture scheme at Peterhead having been, if I'm being charitable, kicked into the long grass, if not completely put to one side, by Westminster, and yet here's the Scottish Government committing to spend £20 million in the northeastern Murray to accelerate the development of a transformed and decarbonised economy there. So is there an element here that the Scottish Government is in a sense having to spend time and money and effort following the problems that arise as a result of Westminster policy and then papering over them or plugging the gaps or putting fingers in dikes to deal with the issues that are arising because of Westminster policy?
I would say fingers and toes and knees and elbows and so on. I mean, there's constant mitigations for the damage that is being wrought on the Scottish economy by Westminster. And I had to laugh again today. You know, the Labour Party was saying, oh, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And they conveniently and frequently forget that Scotland has a fixed budget where they can't massively overspend as Westminster can. And they never say, well, what would they choose to cut? And again, this is another area where the SNP continues to deliver on a balanced budget and never goes over that budget. They always keep a wee bit of contingency back just in case, and then roll on again the next year. So they're very skillful in what they do. But your original point about the constant mitigation is very clear. And I think we're at the point where we need to get the right balance between people understanding that the SNP is rooting for them and that they will do the right thing by them, but also understanding that this mitigation is getting progressively harder to do as cut upon cut is coming in real terms because of the lack of COVID consequentials. As that's coming through, it will get harder. And of course, it brings us back to the backdrop about why are we where we are until we have full control over the money we raise in Scotland to spend to the economic policies that suit us. It's always going to be this juggling, which I think Kate Forbes does extremely well. But let's not forget the big backdrop here.
Absolutely, thank you. And Michelle, and one other aspect under this heading, through this prism, as I say, there's more than £1 billion being spent to decarbonise the rail network, and that includes £250 million being spent enhancing the services in Barrhead, East Kilbride, Fife and the Borders, and then £35 million to help purchase ultra low and zero emission buses and their infrastructure, and £300 million support for free bus travel schemes for young people, for disabled persons, and improving the bus network with smart card technology. At this moment, as we are still in the pandemic, a number of contributors to this programme have commented that they think that they can perceive a significant increase in the use of cars and an equivalent decrease in the use of public transport as a result of people being concerned due to COVID. So do you think, are these spending commitments here, are they likely to have a positive benefit in encouraging people to get back out of their cars and get back into public transport?
Well, you make a fair point. I mean, you did a piece about where we are with, people being ill and tragic deaths with COVID, but let's not forget we're still in the midst of a pandemic, and I understand and sympathise with why people feel safer at the moment in their cars. We're quite uncertain as to what the nature of Omicron will be, and we know it's spreading like wildfire, but how will it affect people? So I understand that. But the other point I would make about some of the things that you listed there, this is infrastructure investment. And we know that that takes time, but we also know that not only does it make people's lives easier if they're able to access train lines and so on, you listed some of them, but also the contribution it makes in economic investment into the economy is very important as well. So there's both about what it means for me in my daily life, but also economic development and investment in the economy. And of course, that was the third theme that Kate Forbes majored on today. So I'm sympathetic at the moment. I think we all hope, are approaching the end of this COVID pandemic. We know we'll have some months yet as it rolls through, and so I'm sympathetic about why people might want to use their cars at the moment, but some of this is future focused, and I think Kate Forbes used that terminology. This was a transitional budget. We hope we're over the worst with COVID, although we've got some issues just now. But so this is a kind of transitional budget and very much starting to look to the future. So I think she correctly called that as well, because we've still got some uncertainties we need to deal with around COVID.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. Now, we've been talking about COVID, and that was the next heading, the next prism through which I was going to have a look at today's budget. And so the list here is a little shorter than the last list I read out, but the headlines I took with regard to the COVID-focused aspects of today's budget were, firstly, maintaining the non-COVID-19 non-domestic rates relief package, which is forecast to save non-domestic ratepayers about £745 million and help businesses get back on their feet after the pandemic. And that includes the small business bonus scheme, and that takes more than 100,000 properties out of the rates system completely. £225 million to deliver a range of national training interventions through Skills Development Scotland. That includes maximising apprenticeship starts. Almost £2 billion for Scotland's universities and colleges in driving an inclusive economy and continuing to deliver high quality education and training for the future workforce. £370 million to support the enterprise agencies, and almost £50 million for Visit Scotland, and that's intended to strengthen key sectors so they prosper and help to drive a net zero economy as we come out of the pandemic. And then £9.2 million to harness the digital ambitions of SMEs and strengthen our digital economy with the same purpose. Now, it struck me in particular that this afternoon, Colin Wilkinson, who's the managing director of the Scottish Licensed Trade Association. Now, we know that on our screens and on our radios and on our pages of our newspapers, licensees have been featured prominently as they complain about the Scottish Government's response to the COVID pandemic. So it struck me it was very striking that today, Colin Wilkinson, who's the managing director of their trade association, said, just when hospitality businesses are beginning to get back on their feet, along comes the Omicron variant to throw a spanner in the works. So the news in today's Scottish budget is a welcome step towards aiding our recovery, but more targeted support will be needed. So that appears to be a cautious and not particularly qualified welcome and agreement from the licensed trade. Do you think that in this context, in this part of the budget, the message is getting through that whilst the COVID responses are being taken for public health reasons, the Scottish Government is still determined to support a whole range of sectors of the economy, including the licensed trade and others?
Well, I think you're pointing out that the challenges that many small businesses have been going through have been recognised. And I mean, you mentioned rates, and of course it was the Scottish Government that businesses didn't need to pay rates, setting aside the ones who already get the full relief from the 1st of April 2020, and it took the UK Government until July 2021 to kind of catch up with the fact that that was a good idea. So many businesses had already had that benefit. And of course, hospitality, we all recognise, has had a really, really tough time of it. And I'm good that they've issued a cautious welcome, because I think people understand that COVID, what's happening with it, can't be controlled, and we just need to manage our way through some very difficult times. But I think they recognise that they are valued and that there's been some mitigation. And I think both the First Minister and the Scottish Government have been very clear that as situations emerge, they'll do their best to support a combination of different sectors. And of course, business is a critical part of that. And I think there were other areas that have given a kind of cautious welcome to it as well. They recognise that the Scottish Government's trying to root for them in some very difficult times. That doesn't mean to say nobody's claiming that the Scottish Government will get everything right. Nobody's claiming that. But I think making it clear that business is valued, and in particular SMEs, I think is very important. I absolutely celebrate that with my background, and you're probably aware I'm on the economy and the finance committees, and therefore economic growth, supporting business, I consider to be very important.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And it struck me within this basket of announcements from the budget today that, in the same way as we were saying under the previous prism of the poverty addressing measures, that there's a future aspect and also, as you were saying, with regard to the infrastructure investment for transportation, there's a very much a future focus in a number of these announcements, given how closely focused they are on education and training. So do you think that the read across from a COVID response into our education sector, and both in terms of educating our future workforce, but also education is a very important employer in Scotland as well. Mm-hmm. Do you think
that was some big... Sorry, that was some big sums there for Skills Development Scotland and for our colleges and universities. And I noticed that Jamie Hepburn was out and about last week, sort of resetting the value he sees in the college sector and making that clear to them. So, yes, again, it's about key messages here. We value education. We value young people going into education. Skills is definitely recognised. And of course, again, this is taking mitigations to address some of the issues that have been caused by Brexit. We know that we have got chronic now labour shortages. This is really biting in many sectors, and we're going to have to retrain some people to be fit for those sectors to pick them up. So again, yeah, definitely future focus, but responding to the needs of the day and with quite a clear message, particularly around Skills Development Scotland.
Thanks, Michelle. The next prism I'm going to use is perhaps a shorter one or a narrower one, and that was really with regard to the expected cost of living challenges, which are going to impact everybody across mm-hmm. Scotland. As we get into 2022, which are already beginning to impact people in Scotland and are expected to get worse through 2022. So there were four announcements today that I bundled together in that sense. Firstly, £90 million to support the most impacted by the pandemic, including long-term unemployed young people and parents. And that funding will also support people upskilling and retraining, including through the Green Jobs Workforce Academy. £23 million for the delivery of Fair Start Scotland services. What that does is provides person-centred support for the people furthest from the labour market. So, for example, disabled people and those who have long-term health conditions, and perhaps people from minority ethnic communities, and those who face other barriers to moving into fair and sustained jobs. Then the public sector pay policy with a floor of £10.50 per hour. And then £3 million for funding for community learning and development, seeking to provide some skills, vital support to some of the most disadvantaged learners, allowing them to increase their skills for learning, life and work, and thereby increasing their incomes, as I say. So these aspects of the budget, is it fair to say that of those four, the public sector pay policy with a floor of £10.50 per hour, is that possibly the headline budget announcement there?
It absolutely is, because again, I think everybody would say we would all like it to be higher, and I'm sure the First Minister, I'm sure Kate Forbes would have said that. But again, what you going through all these different things that have been done across a whole range of areas shows the juggling that's gone on, and of course it's markedly higher than what you have in the rest of the UK. And again, it's saying we value you. We're going to increase that, and that's very important. So yeah, that is a standout one for me from that, but it's not just about the money, it's about what it's saying to people and the value we place, and particularly when, we can't underestimate how difficult times are at the moment for people. They really are. And I'm sure nobody's going to say, right, I'm away out to buy myself that expensive car. But if they actually know quietly that they are appreciated, they've given so much to us over the past couple of years. And I think everybody would agree with that. They've worked so hard. And I think saying we value you is really the message, as well as the money itself. And I'm sure the money itself will help, of course.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michelle. Now we'll move to a broader prism now, which I've described as income and expenditure. And that's really intended to look at, we'll look at some of the context and some of the challenges that are arising in the context of this particular budget this year, and also talk about some of the spending plans too. But first, some context. And while the recent UK government autumn budget and spending review announced what was described then as a significant increase in Scotland's block grant, the reality is a cut in day-to-day funding for each year of the spending review compared to 2021-22. And that's in addition to the continuing challenges of meeting the costs of COVID-19 and Brexit. The average annual increase of £4.6 billion portrayed by the UK government is only a rise after all the 2021 COVID-19 and other one-off funding from the block grant is stripped out. So in practical terms, between 2021-22 and 2022-23, the resource funding is 7.1% less in real terms. And alongside revenue funding, the UK spending review also fell short, I think, of the Scottish Government's capital spending plans, constraining the ability to invest in the infrastructure that's required to support the economy and public services, deliver green jobs, and the technology required to seek to reach net zero. And I think the equivalent reduction for Scotland's capital budget grant is almost 10% in real terms between this coming year and the following year. And also over the longer term, there are similar real term reductions for resource and capital against the current year's funding for 2023-24 and the year after that. So in terms of, and we know also that the Fraser Allender Institute has pointed out that these real terms reduction in both revenue and capital funding are going to present significant challenges. How do you think the government intends to address that particular headwind, having addressed, as we say, the headwind of COVID and of Brexit, this headwind where even after 10 years of austerity, the Conservative government in Westminster is continuing to cut budgets, cut the funding that is provided, which admittedly, originally and ultimately is our money, but the Westminster government is continuing to cut the money that is allocated to the Scottish government.
Well, I think you've just touched on the million-dollar question. What do you do in a situation where you've been withdrawn from hugely significant trading markets, where inflation is galloping, and that's openly acknowledged? There may well need to be an interest rates rise relatively soon. I think most people are anticipating that. Inflation is going to, if not nibble away, arguably bite away at the many of the rises that the SNP government has put in place. So that is a real risk. And perhaps it takes us right back to the backdrop. The idea that the Conservatives turn up in the chamber and say and claim, oh, you've got more money this year. And of course, they've actually front loaded it when you look at it over a sort of 5-year forecast, and claim that that's a good thing. I mean, I in no way want that paucity of ambition for Scotland. That the most we can hope for is that somebody comes along and says, here's a wee bit more money, yet it's not what you're due or anything like that. I mean, that just seems to be utterly ridiculous. So that backdrop about us in Scotland not having control over macroeconomic policies, these fiscal levers, it's really becoming quite stark to me, and I notice it all of the time. And here's another example. We know that some of the big companies are not paying their fair share of tax at all, and they have become extraordinarily wealthy, even more so during this kind of pandemic. Let's think about some of the companies that do all online business. I'm sure we can guess some of them. They are not subjected to the same level of tax, nor indeed do they pay tax in the UK. And that just is utterly outrageous, completely unfair, and is part of the backdrop of a regulatory environment that sits utterly with Westminster, who aren't doing anything about it. So that bigger picture about why are we where we are needs to be understood as well. And I feel very, very strongly that we've got so much further to go. And of course, that so much further to go is called independence.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. Now, in this, we've been talking there a little bit about the income challenges, so I'll change tack and we'll talk about expenditure now a little bit. And given that expenditure on health and social care, it looks to me like it accounts for just about 50% of the, or very nearly half of the Scottish Government's spending. So in that context, from this budget, we have the Barnett consequentials in full for frontline health and care spending and health and care services, and that's going to deliver something like £18 billion. Over 50% of the frontline spend will be directed towards community health services, so increasing primary care funding by 25% during the life of this Parliament, at £12.9 billion for health boards, delivering the first increase to ensure frontline funding, which directly supports patient services, is increased by at least £2.5 billion by 2027. £500 million investment in health infrastructure, supporting continued delivery of the NHS recovery plan, there's COVID again, by increasing capacity and treatments through the expansion of the network of national treatment centres. £1.2 billion for mental health, taking forward the government's commitment to ensure direct mental health funding increases by 25%, and that 10% of all frontline NHS spend goes to mental health by the end of this Parliament, shifting the focus to prevention and early intervention and reducing demand and waiting times for mental health clinical services, and £147 million to address the twin public health emergencies of drug deaths and harms from alcohol, including £61 million specifically to address the national tragedy of drug deaths as part of the commitment to invest £250 million in that area over the lifetime of this Parliament. So looking at that last item first, we've heard announcements we've heard from the Cabinet Secretary, who is responsible for the Scottish Government's response to the twin public health emergencies of drug deaths and harms from alcohol. We've heard announcements this week, and I think there is an expectation, there's an anticipation, it's fair to say, from people to begin to see what the Scottish Government is going to do. I know that has been focused very much on drug consumption rooms, but there's more to it than that. Do you think that this funding will be capable of being delivered quickly enough into these two areas in order to begin to make an immediate impact and improvement on the challenges that we're seeing?
To make an improvement, I think, is a good way of putting it. Of course it will make an improvement. It's directed, targeted funding, and it will make an improvement. But I would caution that we can't underestimate some of the significant challenges that we've got and that will continue to stay with us. So I think you put it very well, to make an improvement. And yes, indeed, I believe it will.
Thanks, Michelle. And thinking again about these very significant amounts of money that are now being budgeted for health and social care, do you think that there's a risk that our spending and our well, there's two risks here. The risk that in terms of spending, especially in health, the more you spend, the more demand there is, and the budgets and the demand just simply continues to increase. Do you think that that's going to be a challenge? And also, do you think that there's a risk that in terms of focus and spending, that the Scottish Government budget is going to become imbalanced because so much money and so much focus is being spent on health and social care?
On the latter point, no, I don't, because it is a fixed budget, and the SNP government always balances its budget, and I think it's recognised by all the political parties that that's something that they do very well. But the point you make about demand is a fair one and is a sound one. And if you think about the new social security policy, for example, it's what they call demand-led. If somebody is entitled to that, then they're entitled to that. And that there's a significant amount of money that will go towards that. And the health service and the services and the provision within that will get increasingly more expensive. And going back to the wider backdrop, I talked about inflation. It's not just about inflation. We've also got chronic issues with our supply chain, where many materials are not available. Say if you want to build a new hospital rather, or you want to extend it, the cost of that is just going to catapult. I mean, I was hearing the other day that they anticipate the cost of cement will go up by 19% in the new year, and indeed most builders are having their supplies rationed. So those kind of elements that feed into an inflationary picture are really quite important. And again, I would cautiously warn that this is going to be challenging. And in other words, if we want to continue the focus on the type of society we want, where we value our public sector workers, where we value our young people, we have to take control of our own fiscal levers. And that does lead back to one area. So again, I am clearly emphasising that. That's why I think Kate Forbes has done a really good job with the range of touch points that she's got to. But this is going to be tough. This is going to be really, really tough. And maybe what the Tories did after the last financial crisis of 2008 with their austerity programme, remember that? They were going to pay down the debt. Well, that didn't work, and so on. I suspect it's going to be more creeping austerity than immediate overnight austerity. But austerity it will be. And we saw the outcome from that because, of course, the economy hardly grew at all. So challenging times ahead and some decisions to be made by a lot of people.
Thanks, Michelle. Now, having run through a number of long lists of budget announcements, I thought it would be only fair to move to one that you might be able to speak a little bit about, because one of the announcements today was a further almost £206 million towards the capitalisation for the Scottish National Investment Bank, helping it to deliver against its missions of supporting Scotland's transition to net zero, building communities and promoting equality and harnessing innovation. Now, in the context of a bank per se, people might scratch their heads a little bit if the notion is that the bank's mission is to build communities and promote equality and harness innovation. However, this is a national investment bank. So can you tell us a little bit about how the bank is progressing and perhaps about what this further significant capitalisation is intended to do?
The Scottish National Investment Bank, in my opinion, is already a success story. Now, in fairness, it's early days yet. It's only been established for a year. But what it's managed to achieve in that year, in terms of its setup and the number of projects that it's managed to invest in, and those projects aligning to what the SNP government believes is very important, and you've already set some of that out. Many other national structures such as that would have consumed a huge amount of money just getting themselves up and established. And to invest in these projects, that means they've already recruited their kind of staff, they've already worked out their processes and so on. So actually, I genuinely believe that it is a success story. The second point I would make is about the importance of investment in businesses that align to our values, that will actually add make money that will grow Scottish homegrown businesses, thought-leading businesses that will make a real difference. For me, this is so important. And for Kate Forbes, for the Scottish Government, I know how important it is as well. And that has to be emphasised. This concept of investing in leading businesses that will align to what we're trying to achieve is utterly vital. And I think the Scottish National Investment Bank, all credit to it after 1 year doing what it's done, and good, excellent that there's more money going into that. That's so important. And that's the kind of hidden side. Investment in businesses, investment in our infrastructure is what is going to help our economy grow. And going back to the start of the programme where we were talking about the impact of Brexit in terms of 4% less and COVID 2% reduction, rather, I should have said, it's these kind of initiatives that will make the real difference. And to be honest, again, my view would be if we weren't constrained by a fixed budget, if we weren't constrained by not being able to borrow like normal governments do, I personally would like to see a whole lot more investment in this kind of area, because that's what makes your economy grow and that's what creates jobs. But we're in this situation where the Scottish Government needs to run a fixed budget, so good on them that they've managed to do what they've done so far, as I'm concerned.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michelle. Now, we could talk about the £40 million to the Scottish Police Authority, the almost £10 million for Fire and Rescue Scotland, the £23 million to support frontline organisations that help eradicate and prevent violence against women and girls. And we could also talk about the £51 million investment in rural services and islands, supporting and delivering the National Islands Plan, introducing something that caught my eye, which is the Islands Bond Fund. However, we have spoken at length and in detail, and you've put up with me listing things very well this evening. I'm very grateful to you. So I thought we might move to the politics at the end of the programme. So firstly, do you think that this budget is an indication that the Butte House agreement signed between the government and the Scottish Greens, that it's working and it's making a difference?
I think so. Now, I mean, remember that this is the first year for some years there hasn't been this kind of horse trading that we've seen. You know, maybe a few years ago we all recall that, was a budget going to get through and they needed the sign up of the Greens. And I think there's been an honesty about the relationship with the Greens right from the off. Nobody's suggesting that, that suddenly they're, the SNP and the Greens are absolute bestest buddies. What they've done is taken an adult approach, which is there is enough commonality in enough areas for them to be able to collaborate together for the benefit of Scotland as a whole. And I think that budget stated that quite clearly today. And I didn't see anything in that people in the SNP were saying, oh, we don't really like that, or likewise with the Greens. So they did seem to find a middle ground. And I think that's the adult politics that people are looking for. Remember, this should be a rainbow parliament. Remember when it was first elected, except none of the other parties have really come up to scratch. And so the SNP have been doing very well, and now they've got this tie up with the Greens. So I think the politics of it has seemed to go well so far. And I'm not saying that there won't be in the future some tight discussions about something. Of course, that's normal in the hurly-burly of politics, but I think this budget really was a good amalgam of the priorities of the SNP and the Greens, and I think that's to the benefit of our politics. That's healthy. It's good.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michelle, because that was our final item this evening.
Oh.
In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now, and we'd be very grateful if you would help us. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in then. I'd like to say thank you to everyone for watching us on Broadcasting Scotland, and a very big thank you indeed to Michelle for joining us this evening. Michelle, thanks a million.
No problem, thank you.
So that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I hope that you keep warm and keep well. Bye-bye.